An hour and a half, that's how long they made him wait. Until the CEO walked in and changed everything. The glass doors of Sterling & Co. Bank slid open. A gust of cool, conditioned air greeted Harry as he stepped inside. The scent of polished mahogany, leather-bound ledgers, and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Everything about this place screamed wealth, exclusivity, and quiet power. Harry had been in places like this before. Rooms built to impress, designed to intimidate, structured to exclude, but intimidation had never worked on him. He wasn't a stranger to high-stakes negotiations. He had walked into boardrooms filled with men who underestimated him and walked out proving every single one of them wrong. He had built his business from nothing. He belonged in places like this. And today he wasn't here to ask for an opportunity. He was here to claim what was rightfully his. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and charcoal gray slacks, Harry exuded confidence. He didn't fidget, didn't check his watch. He moved with purpose. Approaching the reception desk, he found Bertha, the front desk attendant. She sat behind a sleek glass counter. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun. Her fingers tapped lazily against the keyboard, her attention elsewhere. Harry set his leather portfolio on the counter. "Harry Patterson, I have an appointment with Sophie at 11. Bertha barely glanced at him. A nod, a tap on the keyboard. "You're on the schedule. Have a seat. She'll be with you soon." Her voice was flat, mechanical, emotionless. No warmth, no acknowledgement. No real effort to confirm his presence. Harry had seen this before. It wasn't just about professionalism. It was about establishing who mattered and who didn't. He turned toward the seating area, chose a chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight slanted through the glass, casting crisp geometric patterns onto the polished marble floors. The bank hummed with quiet efficiency. Clients spoke in hushed, refined tones. Bankers moved with a sense of purpose and urgency. Behind frosted glass doors, decisions were being made. Deals were being signed. Wealth was being transferred. The power in this place was palpable. Harry watched as a group of well-dressed professionals chatted casually about market trends, their voices smooth, confident, unbothered. These were the kind of people who walked into rooms without hesitation. People who never had to question their access. He exhaled, adjusted his cuffs. He had no reason to expect anything but professionalism. He had confirmed his appointment. Traced. The expectation was simple. Walk in. Discuss terms. Finalize the agreement. But experience had taught him one thing. Things were never that simple. Behind those closed doors, Sophie Lancaster, the bank's senior loan manager, reviewed her schedule. Cold, calculating, selective. She had built a reputation for being tough on loan approvals, especially for clients who didn't fit her unwritten criteria. She was meticulous in her bias. Certain clients received priority treatment. Others, they were left waiting indefinitely. Meanwhile, Henry Whitmore, CEO of Sterling & Co., had just arrived at the bank, a man of power and influence. Henry didn't involve himself in every client meeting, but he valued reputation and efficiency above all else. And then there was Bertha, not a decision-maker, but a gatekeeper, the first barrier between a client and access. She wasn't the one making the rules, but she knew exactly how to enforce them. Harry sat patiently, watching the bank's quiet dance of privilege and power unfold. He didn't know it yet, but today, his presence was about to disrupt everything. Harry sat quietly. His fingers rested against the handle of his briefcase. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the bank in soft, natural light. The numbers on his watch flickered. 11:10 a.m. He had confirmed this appointment twice. There was no reason to expect anything but professionalism. Yet, here he was, still waiting. At first he dismissed it as a simple delay, Banks were busy places. Schedules ran late. Meetings took longer than expected. But Harry had spent years in high-level business negotiations. He knew the difference between a minor delay and a silent dismissal. At 11:15 a.m. he noticed it. A man in a gray suit arrived. His polished shoes tapped lightly against the marble floor as he walked in. He barely needed to say a word before Bertha's demeanor changed. A polite nod, a tight smile. Within moments, a junior banker appeared. A quiet exchange, a quick handshake. And just like that, the man disappeared behind the frosted glass doors. No hesitation. No waiting. No questions. Harry's grip tightened around his briefcase. He checked his watch. 11:20 a.m. Still nothing. At 11:25 a.m., another client strolled in. A woman, her cream-colored blazer crisp and pristine, her designer handbag swinging effortlessly at her side. She was mid-conversation on her phone, not paying attention, not acknowledging anyone. But Bertha? She noticed. Her posture straightened. Her expression warmed. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster." The woman barely glanced at her. Yet, within seconds, a banker appeared, headed her straight past the waiting area, right through the frosted doors. No hesitation, no waiting, no questions. Harry glanced at his watch again. 11:30 a.m. He was still sitting in the same chair. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Certain people, the right people, walked in and were welcomed without question. And others? They were told to wait. Harry exhaled. His patience stretched dangerously thin. He had spent years proving himself in rooms where people had already made up their minds about him before he even spoke. He had built a business from nothing. He had come to this bank with flawless financials, a record of success, a confirmed appointment. And yet, he was still waiting. Slowly he stood. He walked toward the reception desk. Calm, controlled. "Has Sophie been made aware that I'm waiting?" His voice was steady, but firm. Bertha barely looked up. She sighed, like he was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. Her fingers tapped lazily at the keyboard. "She knows," Bertha said flatly. "She's just finishing up with another client." Harry waited. For an update. For a real answer. For something more than an empty reassurance. But Bertha was already back to her screen. "Silence. You have an estimate on when she'll be available?" His voice was still measured, still controlled. Bertha shrugged. "It shouldn't be much longer." That word, should, a delay without a deadline, a promise without commitment. Harry inhaled slowly, through his nose, held it, released it. He knew exactly what was happening. And then, the doors to the bank opened again. Another man walked in, older, dressed in a navy blue suit with quiet authority. Bertha straightened. Immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was light, almost cheerful. The shift in her posture was unmistakable. The respect in her tone, undeniable. A banker appeared, like clockwork, guiding him straight past the frosted doors. No hesitation, no waiting, no questions. Harry's grip tightened around his briefcase. He had been here for over 30 minutes, past his scheduled appointment. And yet, it was as if he were invisible. His presence had been acknowledged, but not prioritized. His time had been noted, but not respected. He could sit back down. He kept waiting. Pretend this wasn't happening? Or he could make sure they understood that ignoring him had been a mistake. Harry adjusted his blazer, exhaled slowly, and made his decision. He wasn't waiting anymore. Harry didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch. His fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. This was a choice. He could return to his seat, Said, let them dictate how much his time was worth. Or he could remind all of them, why overlooking him was a mistake. The decision was easy. Without a word, he turned, not toward the seating area, toward the frosted glass doors leading to the executive offices. His steps were steady, measured, deliberative. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. Sir, Bertha's voice rang out, sharpened with alarm. This wasn't how the rules worked. People like him, people who were supposed to wait quietly until called, didn't just walk in unannounced. But Harry didn't stop. He pushed open the door. The atmosphere shifted immediately. A long corridor stretched ahead, lined with private offices. Some doors open, some closed. The soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic tap of keyboards. This was where the real business happened. And at the end of the hall, through the glass-walled office, he saw her, Sophie Lancaster. She wasn't in a meeting. She wasn't talking to another client. She was sitting at her desk, typing leisurely on her laptop. Alone, Harry exhaled, slowly. So that was the truth. She hadn't been too busy. She hadn't been occupied with other clients. She had simply chosen not to prioritize him. A convenient lie. A quiet dismissal. A way to push him aside long enough that he might give up, might reschedule, might accept being treated like an afterthought. He wasn't in the mood to play that game. Sophie looked up. For just a second, her expression flickered. Surprise, irritation, then calculation. But she recovered quickly. She straightened, folded her hands neatly on the desk. Mr. Patterson, her voice was clipped, polished, controlled. You should have waited to be called. Harry met her gaze, even bothered. I did wait. A beat of silence. Sophie's fingers tapped against the desk. A quiet hesitation. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to walk in, to call her out. Finally she exhaled, gestured toward the chair across from her. Please, have a seat, Harry said. Not because she allowed him to, because he chose to. But something told him this conversation wasn't going to go the way Sophie had planned. She reached for a folder, flipped it open. I apologize for the delay, she said. Her tone was neutral, practiced. We've been extremely busy today. Harry let the words sit there, studied her. Busy. He had watched at least 6 people, some without appointments, walk past him in the last 30 minutes. Were you? His voice was calm, firm. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. There must have been a miscommunication. Harry arched a brow. A miscommunication. He exhaled through his nose. Expression unreadable. Interest. Sophie cleared her throat, eager to move past the moment. She flipped another page in the folder. No. Her voice regained its polished, dismissive edge. Let's discuss your loan application. I've had a chance to review it, but the words barely left her mouth before the door behind Harry swung open. And just like that, everything changed. Before Sophie could say another word, the door behind Harry swung open. The shift in the room was instantaneous.
He didn't need to turn around. He could feel it. The sudden stiffness in Sophie's posture. The way her fingers froze against the folder. The air charged with new energy. Then came the voice. Harry, what the hell are you doing here?
A familiar voice, casual, but with authority woven through it. Sophie's eyes widened, just for a second, before she masked it. But Harry saw the flicker of panic before it disappeared. He turned, and there stood Henry Whitmore, the CEO of Sterling & Co. Bank. Behind him, 2 men in tailored suits. Executives, no doubt. Their sharp gazes flicked between Harry and Sophie. They already sensed something had gone wrong. Harry stood, his handshake firm. "It's been a while, Henry." Henry let out a short chuckle, clapped a hand on Harry's shoulder. "I'll say, you still running Patterson Consulting?" "Still growing it," Harry replied smoothly. And just like that, the room felt different now. Sophie, once composed and in control, now looked distinctly uncomfortable. She had shrunk beneath the realization. Harry wasn't just another client. Not someone she could push aside. Not someone she could dismiss with a vague excuse. He was someone who mattered. And Henry knew it. His expression shifted. The casual warmth in his voice gone. Now it was cooler. "Chopper, how long has Harry been waiting?" The words hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Sophie hesitated. "Too long." Her mind raced, searching for a way to soften the damage, to salvage the situation before it spiraled further out of reach.
There was a scheduling issue, she started, her voice even, but thinner than before. "An hour and a half," Harry interrupted. No hesitation.
"Just truth." Sophie's mouth snapped shut. Silence. Henry's jaw ticked slightly. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment spoke for itself. Sophie shifted in her seat, like she wanted to argue. But she didn't dare. The facts were already laid bare. "An hour and a half," Henry repeated, his tone deceptively light. He let it sit there, then exhaled slowly, shook his head, turned to one of the executives. "Make sure Sophie is off the floor immediately. We'll have a conversation later." The executive nodded once, briskly, then left the room. Harry watched Sophie's fingers tighten around the folder. She didn't speak, didn't protest, didn't even lift her eyes. She just sat there, pale, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Henry turned back to Harry. "You should have called me directly." Shook his head. "I would have made sure you were taken care of." Harry smirked slightly. "Didn't think I needed to." Henry exhaled. Frustration laced through his voice. But it wasn't aimed at Harry. It was aimed at everything else. The mess he now had to clean up. "This isn't how we do things here." Harry tilted his head slightly. "Seems like it is." The words landed harder than Henry expected. He didn't argue. He didn't try to defend it. Because men like Henry, men at the top, knew when something had gone wrong. And right now, Henry was calculating just how big of a problem this was. "Tell me what happened." Harry did. He told him everything. The appointment, the wait, how others had been ushered in before him, Bertha's dismissive tone, Sophie's indifference, the carefully constructed barriers meant to make him feel small, invisible. Henry didn't interrupt. Neither did the two executives. By the time Harry finished, the silence in the room was thick and suffocating. Then, Henry exhaled. "I appreciate you telling me this," he said, his voice steady, but clipped. "And I'll be honest, I'm pissed." Harry arched a brow. Henry let out a humorless chuckle, shook his head. "Because this is the kind of thing that wrecks reputations. We've worked too damn hard to build this institution's credibility, and now I have to clean up a mess I didn't even know existed." He turned to one of the executives. "Fast-track Harry's loan application. I want an approval on my desk by the end of the day." The executive nodded immediately, left the room. Harry raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" Henry met his gaze. "You should have had it 2 hours ago." "I'm fixing the mistake." Harry considered that. This wasn't about generosity or making things right. This was about damage control, keeping the story contained before it spiraled into something bigger. And Harry understood that game better than anyone. "I'll accept the approval," he said, rising to his feet. But fixing this, for me, doesn't fix the real issue. Henry's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. We'll be having a long conversation about that. Harry nodded once, then walked toward the door. But before he left, he met Bertha's gaze one last time. She didn't look nearly as confident now. Outside, the summer heat pressed against Harry's skin. The bank's pristine glass exterior gleamed under the midday sun. But inside, the cracks had already formed. This wasn't just about a loan, not just about Sophie. This was bigger, a game that had played out in 1,000 different places, 1,000 different ways. It wasn't always loud. It wasn't always obvious. But it was always there. The assumption that some people belonged in those offices, while others had to wait. The quiet dismissals, the polite rejections, the carefully constructed barriers that could always be explained away. But not today. Today, someone had to face the consequence. And the next time Sophie Lancaster looked at a name on her appointment list, she'd think twice. The sunlight outside Sterling and Co. Bank was bright, almost blinding. Harry stepped onto the sidewalk. The heat pressed against his skin, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled atmosphere he had just walked out of. Within those polished marble walls and glass-paneled offices, the echoes of what had just transpired still lingered. He paused, took a slow breath, let the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't just about a loan. It wasn't even about Sophie, or Bertha, or the executives scrambling to fix their mistake. It was about something far deeper, something far more insidious. A system built on spoken rules, silent barriers, carefully curated exclusion. And today, for once, that system had been forced to look itself in the mirror. Harry's phone buzzed. A new email. Subject, loan approved. A small smirk formed at the corner of his lips. He already knew that was coming. Henry had made sure of it before Harry even stepped out of the building. But that wasn't the point. The approval itself didn't matter. What mattered was why it had taken Henry's presence to make it happen. Harry turned slightly, glanced back at the bank through the glass doors. Bertha was still at her desk, her expression unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her posture, that told him everything. She knew exactly what had happened. She knew that what she had dismissed as just another client who could wait had turned into something much bigger, a serious problem. And Sophie? Harry doubted she'd be sitting comfortably in that office for much longer. Institutions like Sterling and Co. protected their reputation above all else. Employees like Sophie? They were expendable the moment they became a liability. Henry wasn't going to let one manager's indifference, her quiet exclusions, her selective prioritization of clients, threaten the standing of the bank. So one of two things was about to happen. Either Sophie would learn from this mistake, or she would be replaced by someone who wouldn't make the bank look bad. Either way, this lesson wasn't going to be forgotten. Harry didn't need to look back anymore. He had made his point. This was about more than just him. It was about every client who had been made to wait, every business owner who had walked into a room and had to prove they belonged, while others were welcomed without question, every deal that had been delayed, scrutinized, or dismissed, not because of merit, but because of perception. And today someone had to answer for it. He stepped off the curb, walked toward his car. As he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed again. A message from an old colleague. How did the meeting go? Harry stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, because it had been, not in the way Sophie had expected, not in the way Henry would have preferred, but in a way that mattered. Because today, they had been forced to see him, not as someone who could be pushed aside, not as someone who would just sit and wait, but as someone who would demand what was rightfully his. Harry got into his car. adjusted his sunglasses. As he pulled away from the curb, one thought lingered. Respect isn't given, it's demanded. And today, he got exactly what he came for. In life, opportunities aren't always handed to you. Sometimes you have to claim them. Respect isn't given freely. It's earned, demanded, and reinforced by your actions. Harry's experience at the bank wasn't just about a loan. It was about value, recognition, and refusing to be overlooked. Too often people are made to wait, dismissed, or underestimated simply because of perception. But waiting for fairness doesn't change the system. If you know your worth, don't sit silently. Don't accept being pushed aside. Stand up, speak up, and make your presence known. Because in life, you don't just ask for respect, you command it.